not acting with enough urgency about the challenges with specialty crop agriculture.
Coming up, we're talking California agriculture and building an incubator focused on ag tech with Danny Bernstein, who is the managing partner of Reservoir Ventures and the CEO of the Reservoir, an ecosystem of nonprofit and for-profit ventures tackling California's most urgent challenges and opportunities. The Modern Acre is the podcast for builders in ag that think differently. If you'd like to dig deeper with the Modern Acre, check out our membership community, the Modern Acre Co-op. The Modern Acre podcast is presented by Myland, a soil health company that's revolutionizing agriculture. Through their innovative soil as a service, Myland partners with farmers to improve their soil health with the power of beneficial live native microalgae. The result? Healthier soils, more productive farms, and benefits like smarter water use. Discover how Myland can transform your farm at myland.ag. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. We really appreciate it. New year, new podcast feed. Make sure you're catching every episode of The Modern Acre. This week, we're talking to Danny Bernstein, and man, this was an awesome conversation. Danny is passionate about addressing the challenges, the headwinds in agriculture in California specifically, and he is a ag builder, what we love on this podcast. He is building a fund, he's building an incubator, he's building an ecosystem of services focused on tackling these big challenges through innovation and through startups, specifically starting with robotics. So he is really set up the framework for what he's trying to build in 2025. We talked a little bit about it with Walt DeFlock a few weeks ago, but we get the inside look of how he's thinking about addressing these challenges, how they're going to market. You're going to love this one. Let's jump in with what's top of mind for Danny.
We're working on an insanely ambitious and really hard incubator project called Reservoir Farms. And, practically every waking minute is talking to growers, talking to startups, talking to WGA, talking to economic development types, and really planning and figuring this out. So that's been where my head's at, in spreadsheets, looking at P&Ls, looking at cash flow, and just trying to figure out this really hard thing that we have a ton of conviction behind, but is just extremely challenging.
Yeah, it's a super interesting approach. I went to the announcement at FIRA a couple months back, so excited to dig into everything you're building there with Reservoir. But before we jump in, Danny, let's learn a little bit more about you and what led you into agriculture.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I'm a California kid, born and raised, and I've never lived anywhere else. I figure this is where everyone's trying to get to, so why leave? That's always been my pretty simple philosophy. I grew up in San Francisco. I went to Davis. I spent almost 20 years in Silicon Valley. I helped build a company that raised money from Sequoia and Khosla. So it was a Web 2.0 startup. And then 6 years later, we sold it to Google. And then I spent a couple of years integrating the company into Google. And then I ended up spending a decade there. And that was a hugely formative experience where I learned about strategy, about deal making, about how to work globally, and all these different things. I did a lot of work in ecosystems and ecosystem development, working with startups, working with major corporations, and that was really a hugely transformative moment or early time period for me. And then I spent a couple of years at Microsoft, sort of figuring out what I wanted to be when I grew up. And there are a couple of through lines to that. And something that I came away with when I thought, okay, I've had sort of half of a career or a third of a career. What do I really want to focus on in the future? Or what do I want to be when I grow up? And I really wanted to focus on California. And that came to me from leaving Silicon Valley. We moved to Monterey County. We live in Carmel Valley. And I became sort of closer and closer to feeling like I wanted to understand what was happening locally. Why is it more expensive? Why can't people afford to buy homes? Why can people barely make ends meet on rent? Why are wages drastically lower in rural California than they are in urban California? Why is there an ongoing brain drain? like all of these questions that are like really, really meaty questions. When I was at Google, Google did these massive economic development initiatives for other countries. They did a $10 billion fund for India, a multi-billion dollar fund for Brazil. They set up really large operations in Indonesia. And not to take anything away from them, but I think they viewed California as sort of a solved problem for them from a business perspective, and they viewed it as largely saturated. And so there were none of those economic development motions at scale really happening in California and the American West, even though this is a quintessentially California company. So I saw that as a gap. And I began to wonder, what if I could apply a lot of my energy and a lot of what I've learned to a new set of challenges, which were really about the future of California and the American West. And there are a lot of people trying to solve that in Silicon Valley. But I felt like there was a huge amount of impact to be made, let's say, just outside of Silicon Valley, where there are just a different set of challenges. And I began to listen to things like The Modern Acre. And I began to talk to people like Walter Flock and really understand kind of what's going on. I spent a lot of time at community colleges, at places like Fresno State, Stan State, and met professors, students, just kind of went super deep and wanted to really just understand why things are the way they are, what the challenges are. And that led me to wanting to work on this, really dedicate the rest of my life to it. All my ex-colleagues are working on Gemini, are working on M365 or all these things. They're like, what are you doing? Like, why are you posting on LinkedIn about specialty crops agriculture? But it actually feels incredibly natural for me. In some ways, the first time I feel like in a long time, we're like I've been able to really choose the subject matter of what I get to work on. And it's been amazing.
Yeah, I can hear the passion in your voice. It's, there's something exhilarating about tackling a hard problem that you're so passionate about. So, Danny, what were it's one thing to say, this is where I want to put my time, energy, resources, like structurally, operationally, logistically, like how did you go, like what were the first steps you took? Because this is not a small problem here that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So if you're saying you want to be able to really have an impact in the future of California, specifically really on rural California, then the question is what are the seats by which you can try to solve that problem? And if I was let's say a billionaire, which I'm not, then I could just be a philanthropist. If I wanted to run for office, that would be one way to do it. I could run for Congress. I could run for, a county supervisor position, but I don't want to run for office. Then you kind of start to tick down. You want to run a nonprofit. What are the ways to do that? And I thought that a way to do that would be to start a fund. And the reason is that it would have this sort of really broad ecosystem view. I could work with startups. I could work with universities. I could work with community colleges. I could work with industry. So the way that sort of what that gets you, or the doors that it opens, if you're able to do it, and it's insanely hard, by the way, and we can get into why it's hard, especially as a first-time fund manager. Even though I'm an operator with a track record, first-time fund manager is extremely hard. I felt like the way that I could have the biggest impact would be on starting a fund. And I have a hard time at this point figuring out what's another way that I could have as broad of an impact on the things that I care about personally and authentically than doing what I'm doing now. I don't think I could do it if I started one particular company working on one particular farm implement, or if I started a biologicals company. It would be interesting, but I don't think I could have as broad of an impact that I want to have and that I'm motivated to have. So that's what led me to start a fund. The original scope was really venture capital for Central California. And what I began to realize is that having a purely place-based sort of thesis for the fund was maybe too limiting, and it was a bit confusing, because there are many, many technologies that are, let's say, being developed in Australia or Brazil that could have a massive impact on California. And I didn't want those companies, or let's say even those investors, those LPs, to think that we weren't thinking that way. And that's been a huge eye opener, and it's been extraordinarily rewarding, because now I'm having almost daily conversations with investors in Brazil, investors in Australia, investors in the UK, because we know that the challenges of specialty crop agriculture are actually really similar in a lot of those places. Labor, those sorts of things. And so we began to evolve that. The fund was originally called Hawk Tower. And Hawk Tower was named after a poet in Carmel named Robinson Jeffers, who built his home from scratch in the Central Coast. It still stands. The house is called the Tor House, and he built a tower using stones from the land called Hawk Tower, and it's still there. When you're walking around Carmel, you can walk down scenic about a mile from Carmel by the Sea, and you'll see Hawk Tower. And this idea actually really inspired me because I was interested in what is the future of California's natural resources and our working lands. And so naming it Hawk Tower had significant symbolic meaning. And the hawk as a symbol actually has a lot of resonance in the Hispanic community, in the Native community, and other communities. So it translates. It's a symbol of strength. It's a symbol of loyalty. It's like a storytelling symbol. So Hawk Tower for me was a great name, and I got great feedback on it. The idea all along was that what Hawk Tower would do is bring accelerator incubator into rural regions of California. We would be the LP in an accelerator. That was the strategy. And the gap that we observed is that there are really conspicuous gaps in entrepreneurial infrastructure in rural regions of California and the American West. You have Y Combinator in San Francisco. You've got Skydeck in Berkeley. There are actually over 20 startup accelerators in Berkeley. In Berkeley alone, there are 20 startup accelerators. So we began to study accelerators in rural California, and we found some, like Valley Ventures at the Wet Center. We found Santa Cruz Works. So we began to learn about those programs, and they were great people run by exceptional leaders, but they didn't meet the bar characteristically, objectively and characteristically, of the accelerators and incubators in urban regions of California. So I could not find a single accelerator incubator that I would say met the bar. And so I set out to either invest in one, and if I couldn't find one to invest in, we would launch it ourselves. And that exercise was significant because the decision to launch an accelerator incubator is like launching a second company. And so we spent 9 months doing diligence on the strategy, and then only in June of 2024 decided to do it ourselves. And that was as a result of a partnership with Western Growers Association, and then to an extent, University of California Ag and Natural Resources, UCANR. We worked very closely together, and we did a multi-month feasibility study, hours and hours and hours. We spoke to over 50 companies in the specialty crops agriculture space broadly, Kubota, Deere, Driscoll's, Taylor, etc. And we learned about basically what the gaps were and what the needs were. And this led to this idea that we would launch a ag tech incubator that combined a working specialty crops farm with a robotics development center. And we have studied incubators on a global basis. We've spoken to some academics who actually kind of contributed to helping invent the idea of an accelerator incubator, like Greg Horowitz at UC San Diego. And we could not find another accelerator incubator that was characteristically similar in the United States and maybe around the world. We called it Reservoir, and the facility is called Reservoir Farms. We had a working title, Reservoir, really from June until October. And then at FIRA, a couple of months ago, we announced it publicly. And the reception has been overwhelmingly positive. We've had startups reaching out to us every single day from around the world asking when we're opening. I have people asking us to tour the facility, even though it's not open yet. And we've gotten really great feedback. We've learned a lot. We've honed our models. We've honed our spreadsheets. We've honed our P&Ls. We have a really clear idea now of what we're up to. And then that's what led us to decide to say, you know what, we have Hawk Tower and we have Reservoir. We should probably unify. So that's why we decided in December to say that it's now one thing. And Hawk Tower is now Reservoir Ventures, and the facility is Reservoir Farms. So that's kind of what got us here. A huge journey, lots of learning, a few gray hairs, but it's been an amazing year. I've learned so much.
Super cool. Love the two different areas of focus. Would love to kind of dig into the accelerator. Like, makes total sense when you were giving the pitch at Fear of like leveraging kind of a shared space where you can learn. It seems almost like a WeWork for ag tech companies, where it's like you don't need to have all this duplication of the system of like have your own barn and your own electrical, like all that kind of stuff to kind of feed into one org. Danny, maybe get into the economics of an accelerator. I'm sure like companies are probably paying for the service to run through the accelerator, and like you would potentially get rights to invest in the future. Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the economics of accelerator incubators are actually pretty tough because they're basically program economics and facility economics. And WeWork is an example. Bitwise is another example of accelerator incubators that just really didn't pencil. And this is something that we figured out really early on when we studied other incubators, that economically, they're really challenging businesses. They are really lean businesses. And it's really actually very hard to make an accelerator pencil. The reason it works for Y Combinator is they have such a massive fund that they're able to use the management fees to subsidize the accelerator incubator. But an accelerator incubator is not in and of itself something that you can run profitably unless you have an extraordinarily data supplied, market informed business model. And so what a decision that we made on some great advice that I got from one of our advisors is, why not do it as a nonprofit? And so we actually formed a 501c3. We have a real board, University of California. We have growers on the board. Jason Sedano from Taylor Farms is on the board. We have a super legit board. Daniel Kirstein, who used to be the CFO at FarmWise. So we formed a real board. We have monthly board meetings. We have tax exempt status. But the result of doing it as a nonprofit is that we open ourselves up to other potential funding sources. So we can receive corporate donations that are that can be written off. We can receive public funding. We can partner a lot more easily. We actually can make our finances very transparent, and it actually allows us to, I think, be more long-term sustainable. So our facilities, which will open in 2025, will generate revenue from membership fees. So startups that want to be in residence will pay for access to the shop, pay for access to a minimum of 1 acre, and they'll also be able to store their equipment securely. And I think the biggest benefit is that they'll be on a platform where it's a Western Growers partnership facility. So they're going to have growers coming through constantly. And our Salinas location, for example, is going to be on Highway 68, which is like part of the Mount Rushmore of California agriculture. Like, this is a very conspicuous location. It is, less than 10 minutes away from Taylor's, Driscoll's, Church, Diorigo, TNA, et cetera. So the idea of being really in those locations, we think is going to be really valuable and will drive willingness to pay. That's been the signal from the market. The second area is that we'll develop corporate partnerships. We'll develop partnerships with OEMs, with growers, with suppliers, with distributors who want to be there, who want to be engaging with that community. We really view this as a nonprofit ecosystem, but it's also a commercial ecosystem. So we think we'll derive value from that. And there's public fundings and grant opportunities available as a nonprofit. And the primary kind of nonprofit mission, I would say it's twofold. One is that we want to see the sustainability of California's working lands. And we view that as a significantly important mission, that we should not be importing our food supply. The joke that Walt and I have is that if we were as concerned about importing our micronutrients as we are our microchips, we'd be making very different decisions about national security. But that's not the case. So we are on a mission to help sustain California's working lands. That's a big part of it. And the other side is around workforce development. So there's a misperception around ag jobs that they are dead-end jobs. We're examples of this, that we can see opportunities for high road jobs in agriculture and working lands. And we need to connect commercial outcomes with workforce development outcomes. So there are ag jobs, the future of ag jobs, which are really ag tech jobs, are accessible to existing members of those communities. That's something we've been very focused on. And so our Reservoir Farms facilities are actually done in direct partnership from day one with the California Community College system. So that's a little bit about like how we're doing it, because the economics are really challenging, and without being super market informed about it, you'll flame out. You'll be open for a year, you'll run at a deficit, you'll realize that sponsors don't want to play, and then you won't exist after year one.
This is all just so fascinating. I think it's super cool. I think the next logical place to go is, okay, you set up this awesome incubator, nonprofit, all the benefits, and now you got to get companies in, right? So what's the process look like? You said you're getting a call a day, so I'm sure that is an interesting exercise for you. Like, how are you vetting? I'm really fascinated by this topic. You mentioned Y Combinator. how they have just like this dialed process and a very simple process to get approved into YC that they've, perfected over the years. Like, how are you thinking about that piece of the puzzle?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I would love your guys' feedback on, and I say we're still discussing it. We will value, companies that are solvent and that can pay our membership fees, that can help us sustain our operations. So, companies that are properly funded, that can make longer term commitments, that'll be valuable. So, this is an incubator, not an accelerator. So companies can be there for 2 years if they'd like. That's our maximum. We have no problem with a company being there through pre-seed, through seed, and maybe they move out at Series A. I think that would be an amazing outcome. The kinds of continuum we're imagining. We're also imagining that companies. We actually have heard a huge amount of interest for California market entry. So imagine, for example, that the Brazilian consulate and the agricultural division might have a membership, and that they can just sort of constantly be having companies that are in residence at Reservoir Farms who want to be doing business in California. So that's something that we've heard, a signal we've heard from Japan, from Australia, from the UK, from the Netherlands, from Brazil, from Israel, that they are viewing the California market, of course, as very complementary with similar challenges around specialty crops and are solving similar challenges. So we imagine that we'll have international companies there. We've been calling Reservoir Farms the Olympic Village of ag tech. I think it would be amazing to hear multiple languages spoken and for connections to be made in that respect. We also imagine that OEMs will want to incubate projects there. So imagine that a very large OEM, it could be a yellow and green OEM or an orange and black OEM, for example, want to have some of their portfolio companies or maybe some implement projects that are in residence there. And they want growers to kind of be engaging on that. So we think we can develop a very organic ecosystem around that. So those are some of the things we've been talking about. We also imagine that we'll be initiating some of the projects as well. We see a lot of gaps between growers, startups, engineering firms, and data. It's sort of like a bit of a black hole right now. And so part of what we've been talking about at the Reservoir is whether we can initiate some projects of our own and then have them in residence at the Reservoir or at Reservoir Farms, and they would pay membership like everyone else. So we do imagine that we'll be incubating some projects there as well.
Danny, it sounds like the focus is a lot on kind of like robotics automation, but are you open to like other areas of ag tech, whether it's farm management software or like irrigation technology? Are you looking at kind of all those areas or just specific focus?
It's a great question. I think we've really designed the core of the facility footprint for robotics and for automation, for drones, rovers, etc. But there's no reason why an agri-fintech company, a farm management software company, a sensors company wouldn't also derive huge amounts of benefit. Our portfolio right now is actually 50% agri-fintech. And so we're huge believers in sort of, the kind of the data, managing this data problem that farmers are running into. We're now at the point where we're generating huge amounts of data as growers, but we're not necessarily, deriving all the benefit that will come. So we're actually very, very bullish on agri-fintech and the adoption mechanisms for agri-fintech. And so we would love for there to be software companies that are in residence there as well. So that's an obvious one. And then I think there's like a whole set of component ecosystems around sensors, around, it could be irrigation. I would kind of largely put that in the precision ag bucket. And that we think there's a lot of opportunity for that. They may not need their own shop, but they want to have access to 10 acres to do X or Y. I think that's really interesting. And then the other would be around, bio-based innovation, could be biologicals, it could be regenerative agriculture companies. That's another area of significant interest as well. We want to be a place where a lot of learnings about regenerative agriculture can happen. And we're seeing that it's just more and more accepted as sort of being not froofy or hippie, but just practical. Because it's good economics. And so we're going to be interested in regen ag companies. It could be a biochar company or whatever it might be. But I would, generally speaking, I'm very bullish and excited about bio-based innovation. And we hope to be investing in lots of bioeconomy companies. So we're talking about how this can also be a sort of a launch pad for bioeconomy projects as well.
So you've made this big launch. You're aligning under one brand. We're entering 2025. Like, what are you hoping to get out of the year?
Yeah, it's a great question. We hope to launch 3 facilities in 2025. We're hoping to launch 2 Reservoir Farms facilities, one in the Salinas Valley, one in the Central Valley. And then we've talked a little bit about our plans for a bioeconomy lab. We're calling it Reservoir Labs. We might call it Reservoir Bio. We'll see. There's a bit of an internal debate happening right now. But we want to launch a bioeconomy focused wet lab incubator in the Central Valley. And so that's something we've been also talking about. So can we end 2025 with 3 active facilities where we're learning, we're getting startups in residence, we're starting to see a lot of activity come through? I think that'd be amazing. We also hope to close our fund next year. We've gotten great feedback on it, and we did first close. We filed with the SEC in April, so it's called a Form D. We opened our fund in April. We did our first close in June. We hope to close our fund next year. And so kind of wrapping up Reservoir Ventures 1 and deploying capital and hopefully even dipping into some of the reserves. That's our plan. And so I think, ending next year with really feeling like we're a little bit more in execution mode and maybe starting to think about Fund 2 and starting to kind of revisit some of those conversations with our first LPs. I would also say that we want to start to see some of those, more generative outcomes as well. Can we start to see the first workforce development outcomes? Can we start to see the first internships at Reservoir Farms for community college students? Can we start to build more relationships with, sort of the academic ecosystem, with the sort of the workforce ecosystem, with the community-based organization ecosystem? I think that's something we're also looking at. We are, have developed a lot of really special relationships with entities like Digital Nest and Hartnell College. So we've studied and spent a lot of time with them, and we've done a lot of planning about how we can bring some of our plans together. And so my hope also would be that we can bring together some of these workforce outcomes as well.
Exciting things ahead in 2025. Excited to have you open those facilities and check them out later in the year. Danny, you've been just diving in headfirst to rural California, agriculture in general. Really curious what your ag hot take is.
Yeah, my ag hot take is that we're not acting with enough urgency about the challenges with specialty crop agriculture, and that more technology energy, more R&D energy at a federal level, at a state level, at an ecosystem level. This should be much more subsidized at a federal level. That is a concern. It's a hot take. For every 10 defense startups I know that have raised money from the DoD, I know one ag tech company that's raised public funding. So I would like to see a lot more urgency from this incoming administration on not just defense innovation, not just warfighter innovation, but also farm worker innovation and specialty crop agriculture innovation. I view the challenges as equal level imperatives with similar kind of global and macro kinds of imperatives and challenges. So my hot take is exponentially more urgency at an ecosystem level about the future of specialty crop agriculture.
What do you think of the secretary pick, if you're willing to comment on that? Like, how realistic do you think that there's some changes and there's some more energy, like you mentioned, put in these directions?
I think it's going to be on us, people like us, to actually really build the narrative and to bring some very concrete asks forward to this new administration about how they can help. I'm encouraged about how they're talking about defense innovation. We were seeing similar things in the last few years around defense innovation, and we saw some bright spots like Anduril pop up, but there isn't the Anduril of ag tech. And that's a concern. And so the question would be, what do you have to believe for there to be an entrepreneurial infrastructure in agricultural technology and natural resource technology that mirrors some of the more recent motions around defense? And if we can put together a sound plan for this incoming administration, for the secretary pick, I believe they'll take it very seriously, because rural voting patterns is what made this administration happen. And to then kind of want to feed into those economic motions and to kind of think, hey, how do we lift further? How do we continue to strengthen that base? I think that's the opportunity. So, at a micro level, this sort of pick versus that pick, I just think it comes down to, can we put together stories and imperatives and plans that DC can respond to?
Well, Danny, this has been a ton of fun. Thanks for coming on the pod. As we wrap up, how can our listeners connect with you and Reservoir?
Yeah, easy. We just launched our new website at reservoir.co, not reservoir.com, because that was going to cost probably $1 million. So, maybe after our first IPO, we'll go and buy reservoir.com. But reach out to us, reservoir.co. Follow us on LinkedIn. We're Reservoir Co on all the socials. Really appreciate it, guys. And, I continue to love listening to Modern Acre and learn a lot from you guys, learn a lot from your guests. So thanks for having me on.
All right, hope you guys enjoyed that conversation. Check out the Reservoir. Check out Danny on LinkedIn. Everything's linked in the show notes. We appreciate you tuning in. We'd love to connect with you. If you are on LinkedIn, which all of you are, be sure to connect with Tim and I. We'd love to connect with you there, learn what you're up to, learn what you're building. We love hearing from builders in agriculture. So feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn, Tim and Tyler Nuss, and be sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you can tune in next week. Thanks, guys.